My name is Evelyn, and I'm 35 years old. I'm sitting here in my tiny apartment surrounded by boxes and the echo of empty walls. 6 months ago, my ex-husband Marcus fought tooth and nail to take everything from me in our divorce. The house, both cars, our savings accounts, investments, even my grandmother's antique china collection that had been in my family for 3 generations. He was ruthless, determined to leave me with nothing. But you see, Marcus was so focused on winning, so obsessed with destroying me financially, that he never stopped to question why I suddenly stopped fighting back. Before we continue the story about how his greed became his ultimate downfall, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you want to hear how the storage unit I begged him not to take became the very thing that sent him to federal prison. Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I chose to ignore. I met Marcus when I was 24 years old, fresh out of my MBA program, and starting my career as a marketing coordinator at a Fortune 500 company in Manhattan. He was everything I thought I wanted in a partner: charming, ambitious, successful. At 28, he was already making 6 figures as an investment banker at one of the most prestigious firms on Wall Street. Our first date was at Le Bernardin, where he ordered wine without looking at the price and told me about his plans to retire by 40, with enough money to never worry about anything again. We got married 2 years later in a lavish ceremony at a country club in Connecticut. 400 guests, a 12-piece band, flowers flown in from Holland. My parents were overwhelmed by the extravagance, but Marcus insisted that appearances mattered in his world. His colleagues, his clients, everyone needed to see that he had arrived. That should have been my first real warning. But I was 26, and in love with a man who seemed to have the world at his feet. Our life together looked perfect from the outside. We bought a 5-bedroom colonial in Westport, Connecticut, complete with a swimming pool, tennis court, and 3-car garage. The mortgage was astronomical, but Marcus assured me his bonuses would cover it easily. We drove matching Mercedes, his in black, mine in white. We vacationed in the Hamptons every summer, went skiing in Aspen every winter. We were members at 3 different country clubs because Marcus needed to network with different circles of wealth. I had advanced in my career too, becoming a marketing director at 30, pulling in a comfortable 6-figure salary myself. But it was never enough for Marcus. Every raise I got, every bonus I earned, he had to top it. When I made $120,000, he made sure everyone knew he was making 3 times that. When I got a company car as part of my promotion, he went out and leased a Porsche 911 without even discussing it with me. Everything was a competition, even within our own marriage. The first real crack in our perfect facade came when I started noticing discrepancies in our finances. Despite our combined income of nearly $500,000 a year, we seemed to be constantly short on cash. Marcus handled all our investments and major financial decisions, assuring me that he was the expert and I should focus on my career and let him handle the money. But packages would arrive at the house that he'd quickly spirit away. Expensive watches would appear on his wrist with vague explanations about client gifts. Our credit card statements, which he insisted on managing, would arrive and disappear before I could review them. When I finally managed to intercept one of our statements, I discovered 3 credit cards I didn't know existed, all maxed out with purchases from high-end stores, restaurants I'd never been to, hotels in the city when he was supposedly working late at the office. When I confronted him, he exploded, accused me of not trusting him, of trying to control him, of being paranoid and insecure. He had explanations for everything. The hotel charges were for client meetings, the restaurant bills were business dinners, the shopping was for networking gifts. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. Then came the business trips. What started as occasional overnight stays in Boston or Philadelphia became weekly trips to Miami, Los Angeles, Las Vegas. Always for important clients, always crucial deals that only he could handle. His phone was constantly buzzing with texts he'd read and quickly delete, calls he'd take in another room speaking in hushed tones. When I'd ask about them, he'd wave me off with talk of sensitive negotiations and confidentiality agreements. The loneliness was crushing. I'd come home to our massive house, cook dinner for one, and wonder when my marriage had become a solo performance where I played the role of happy wife to an empty audience. Friends would ask about Marcus at social events, and I'd make excuses. He was closing a big deal meeting with international clients, handling important business. Inside, I was dying a little more each day. The worst betrayal came when I found out I was pregnant. After 3 years of trying, I was finally carrying our child. I planned a special dinner to tell him bought a tiny pair of Yankees booties since he was such a fan. When he finally came home at 11 that night, reeking of perfume that wasn't mine, I couldn't hold back my news. His reaction destroyed me. He didn't smile, didn't hug me, didn't show an ounce of joy. Instead, he asked if I was sure if it was too late to reconsider, if this would affect my ability to work and contribute to our lifestyle. 3 weeks later, I lost the baby. I was alone when it happened. Marcus was on another business trip, this time to Chicago. I called him 17 times from the emergency room. He finally called back the next morning, said he'd been in meetings all day and his phone had died. But when I checked our credit card statement weeks later, there were charges from a Chicago steakhouse that night, a bill for $200 at a champagne bar, and a charge at Tiffany's that he never explained. Everything changed the day my friend Melissa pulled me aside at a charity luncheon. She worked at a marketing firm downtown and had been at a client dinner at the Capitol Grill the night before. She'd seen Marcus there, tucked into a corner booth with a blonde woman who looked barely old enough to drink legally. They weren't discussing business. Melissa had watched them for 20 minutes, she said. Watched the way he touched her hand, the way she laughed at his jokes, the way they left together with his hand on the small of her back. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. I hired a private investigator named James Morrison. He came highly recommended by a divorce attorney I'd consulted in secret. James was a former FBI agent who specialized in financial fraud and infidelity cases. His retainer was expensive $5,000 that I pulled from my personal savings account that Marcus didn't know existed, money I'd been setting aside from cash bonuses and freelance work. What James uncovered over the next 3 months was worse than anything I could have imagined. The affairs were just the tip of the iceberg. There wasn't just one woman. There were at least 4 that James could document. The blonde from the restaurant was Brittany, a 23-year-old intern at his firm. There was also Cynthia, a divorced real estate agent who Marcus was seeing every Tuesday when he claimed to have late meetings. Jennifer, a cocktail waitress at a gentleman's club in the city. And Andrea, the wife of one of his biggest clients. But the affairs were nothing compared to the financial crimes James discovered. Through a contact at the SEC, James learned that Marcus was under preliminary investigation for insider trading. He'd been using information from his position to make illegal trades through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. The profits were substantial, over $2 million, that never appeared on our tax returns. He'd been doing it for at least 5 years, carefully moving money through shell companies and foreign banks. The tax evasion was equally stunning. Marcus had been keeping 2 sets of books for his side consulting business, reporting only a fraction of his income to the IRS. He'd created fake business expenses, phantom employees, fraudulent deductions. James estimated he'd avoided paying nearly $800,000 in taxes over the past 6 years. There were forged documents with my signature, making me technically complicit if I couldn't prove I hadn't signed them. I spent the next 2 months playing a role worthy of an Academy Award. During the day, I was the devoted wife keeping up appearances, attending his company events, smiling at his colleagues who probably knew about his affairs. At night, when Marcus was with one of his women, I was methodically copying every document in his home office: bank statements, tax records, investment portfolios, emails he'd foolishly printed and filed. I photographed everything with a high-resolution camera James had provided, creating digital backups of evidence that would eventually fill 12 bankers' boxes. The storage unit was my stroke of genius. I rented it in both our names at a facility 40 minutes outside of town, paid for a full year in advance with a cashier's check. I told Marcus it was for storing some of my grandmother's things that I'd inherited, plus old college memorabilia and seasonal decorations to clear out the garage. He barely acknowledged it, just grunted his approval while scrolling through his phone. Over several weeks, I carefully transported the evidence to the storage unit, but I was clever about it. I didn't just dump boxes of incriminating documents there. I layered them strategically. On top were actual valuable items, my grandmother's real china, some genuine antique furniture from my family photo albums, things that looked sentimental but had modest monetary value. Underneath, in boxes labeled things like Christmas ornaments, college textbooks, and old tax returns, I placed the copied evidence of his crimes. Every forged document, every hidden bank statement, every email about illegal trades, every receipt from hotels and jewelry stores. The confrontation came on a Thursday evening in March. I decided I'd gathered enough evidence and couldn't continue the charade any longer. Marcus came home at midnight, thinking I was asleep. I was sitting in his study, my laptop open to a photo James had taken that afternoon of Marcus entering a hotel with Brittany. When he walked in and saw me there, his face went through a series of expressions. Surprise, anger, then a cold calculation as he tried to figure out what I knew. The conversation was brief. I told him I knew about the affairs, all of them. I told him I wanted a divorce. I didn't mention the financial crimes, the insider trading, the tax evasion. That was my ace in the hole, and I needed to play my cards perfectly. His response was exactly what I'd expected. He laughed, actually laughed, and told me I'd get nothing. He said his lawyers would destroy me, that I'd be lucky to walk away with the clothes on my back. He said I should be grateful he'd given me the lifestyle I'd enjoyed, and that without him, I was nothing. That night, I moved into the guest bedroom. The next morning, he was gone before I woke up, but he'd left a business card on my pillow. Davidson, Krensky and Associates, the most vicious divorce attorneys in Connecticut. The message was clear. He was going for blood. The divorce proceedings began with all the subtlety of a declaration of war. Marcus's attorney, Richard Davidson, was known throughout Connecticut as the lawyer you hired when you wanted to utterly destroy your spouse. His retainer alone was $50,000, which Marcus paid without blinking. Davidson's first move was to file an emergency motion to freeze our joint assets, claiming I was a flight risk and might empty our accounts. The irony wasn't lost on me, considering Marcus had already moved $200,000 to accounts I supposedly couldn't access. In our first mediation session, Marcus sat across from me with a smirk that made my skin crawl. He was wearing his Rolex Submariner, the one he'd bought with money he'd stolen through insider trading, though he didn't know I knew that. Davidson laid out their position with theatrical flair. Marcus was the primary breadwinner, the financial genius who'd built our wealth. I was portrayed as a spoiled wife who'd contributed nothing but spending and complaints. They wanted me to walk away with 20% of our assets, no alimony, and none of the investments Marcus had made in his own name. My attorney, Patricia Winters, was a stark contrast to Davidson's bombast. Quiet, methodical, and brilliant, she'd been recommended by James when I'd explained my long-term strategy. Patricia understood immediately what I was doing and played her part perfectly. In mediation, she appeared overwhelmed by Davidson's aggression, constantly asking for breaks, seeming to fumble with paperwork. It was all calculated to make Marcus and his team overconfident. The cruelest part of Marcus's strategy was his attempt to paint me as mentally unstable. He submitted affidavits from friends of his people I'd thought were our friends, claiming they'd witnessed erratic behavior, emotional outbursts, signs of depression and anxiety that made me unfit to manage finances. His secretary testified that I'd called the office repeatedly demanding to know where he was, showing signs of paranoid delusion. The fact that I'd been calling because I was miscarrying our child alone in a hospital was conveniently omitted. Marcus even had a psychiatrist ready to testify about my supposed mental health issues, despite the fact that I'd never met the man. It was character assassination at its finest, designed not just to win the divorce, but to humiliate me completely. He wanted me broken financially and emotionally. The local gossip mill was already churning. At the grocery store, at the gym, I could feel people staring, whispering, "Poor Evelyn, they said she really fell apart when she found out about Marcus's success." During this time, I perfected my performance as the devastated wife. In court, I cried at exactly the right moments. When Davidson would make particularly vicious accusations, I'd visibly flinch. When Marcus testified about my emotional instability, I'd lower my head and dab at my eyes with tissues. Patricia would object weakly, allowing Davidson to steamroll her. The judge, an older man named Harrison, who'd been going through the motions of divorce court for 20 years, barely looked up from his paperwork. The storage unit became a point of contention exactly as I'd planned. During asset division discussions, I made a show of begging to keep it. I told the court it contained irreplaceable family heirlooms, memories of my deceased grandmother, things that had no monetary value, but meant everything to me sentimentally. I actually broke down sobbing when Davidson suggested liquidating its contents. Marcus watched my performance with sadistic pleasure. Here was something I clearly cared about, something that mattered to me emotionally, and he could take it just to hurt me. Davidson made taking the storage unit a key point in negotiations. He argued that since it was marital property rented during our marriage, Marcus had every right to its contents. When Patricia weakly suggested we could share access, Davidson laughed outright. His client wanted a clean break. No shared property, no reason for continued contact. If I wanted anything from that unit, I should have thought of that before being, as he put it, a problematic spouse. My family was devastated by my apparent surrender. My sister Lauren called me nightly begging me to fight back. She knew Marcus was lying about everything, knew I'd been a devoted wife who'd suffered in silence. My parents offered to mortgage their house to help me hire a better lawyer, someone who could match Davidson's aggression. I told them all the same thing. Sometimes you have to know when you're beaten. Sometimes walking away is the only option. They thought I'd given up. In reality, I was just getting started. Even my friends started to doubt my strategy. Rachel, who'd known me since college, staged what she called an intervention. She gathered 5 of our closest friends at her house, sat me down and told me I was letting Marcus walk all over me. They knew about Brittany, had heard rumors about the other women. They couldn't understand why I wasn't using the infidelity against him. Connecticut was an at-fault state after all. I could have destroyed him with proof of adultery. I just smiled sadly and said I didn't have the energy to fight anymore. The court hearings became increasingly hostile. Davidson painted a picture of me as a gold digger who'd married Marcus for his money and was now trying to cash out. He presented evidence of my spending, conveniently omitting that most purchases were for our household or gifts Marcus had insisted I buy for his clients' wives. He showed the court my salon bills, my gym membership, my clothing expenses, as if maintaining the appearance Marcus demanded was somehow evidence of my greed. Marcus testified with practiced sincerity about how he tried to make the marriage work. He spoke about my mood swings, my irrational jealousy, my inability to understand the demands of his career. He actually teared up when he talked about the miscarriage, spinning it as something that had broken me mentally, making me impossible to live with. The man who hadn't even come home when I was bleeding in a hospital bed was now playing the grieving would-be father. It took every ounce of self-control not to leap across the courtroom and scratch his eyes out. Patricia continued to play her part brilliantly. Her objections were weak, her cross-examinations ineffective. She let Davidson control the narrative while appearing to struggle with basic court procedures. At one point, Judge Harrison actually had to explain a simple point of law to her, his condescension obvious. Marcus and Davidson exchanged smirks, certain they were dealing with an incompetent opponent. They had no idea Patricia had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law and had spent 10 years as a prosecutor before switching to family law. During the final settlement conference, I made one last desperate plea for the storage unit. I brought photos of my grandmother, spoke tearfully about the china set she'd left me, the wedding dress I'd stored there, the memories I couldn't bear to lose. Davidson actually rolled his eyes as I spoke. Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, enjoying every second of my humiliation. When I finished, he spoke for the first time in the session. Those 4 words sealed his fate, though he didn't know it yet. He said, "I want it all." The final divorce decree was everything Marcus had wanted and more. He got the house in Westport, both Mercedes vehicles, 80% of our liquid assets, all of the investment accounts in his name, and yes, the storage unit with everything in it. I was left with $20,000, my personal belongings, and a 12-year-old Honda Civic I'd kept from before our marriage. The alimony he'd have to pay was insulting $500 a month for 2 years, barely enough to cover groceries. The day I had to hand over the keys to our house was carefully orchestrated theater. I made sure neighbors were watching as Marcus arrived in his black Mercedes, wearing his best suit, looking every inch the successful banker who'd won everything. I stood in the doorway in jeans and an old sweater boxes of my belongings, stacked on the lawn like a garage sale. He walked past me without a word, but I saw the satisfaction in his eyes. He'd won. He'd destroyed me just like he'd promised. What made it worse was that he'd brought Brittany with him. She couldn't have been more than 24 blonde hair extensions flowing down to her waist, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent would be. She walked through my house, my former house, pointing at walls and talking about paint colors. When she saw me watching through the window, she actually waved a little finger wiggle that was meant to twist the knife deeper. I loaded my boxes into the Honda, each trip deliberately slow, letting the neighbors get a good long look at poor Evelyn reduced to nothing by her powerful ex-husband. Margaret from next door actually came over with a casserole and a hug, whispering that she knew what Marcus was really like. Her husband played golf with him, had heard the bragging about his conquests. But knowing and proving were different things, and in the court of law, Marcus had proven he deserved everything. My new apartment was in a converted factory building in Bridgeport, a far cry from Westport's manicured lawns and country club lifestyle. 600 square feet, one bedroom, a kitchen so small I could touch both walls with my arms spread. The first night there, I sat on a blow-up mattress, eating Chinese takeout from a paper container and smiled. Marcus thought he'd exiled me to poverty. He had no idea I'd chosen this place specifically paid cash for 6 months up front, and had another $20,000 in an account he didn't know about. Meanwhile, Marcus was living his best life, or at least performing it for social media. His Instagram became a parade of excess. Photos from the country club where he'd kept the membership and explicitly banned me. Vacations with Brittany to St. Bart's, Dubai, Monaco. He bought a new Porsche, painted it bright red like a middle finger to the world. His posts always had captions about new beginnings and cutting dead weight from your life. His finance bros liked and commented with fist bump emojis and congratulations on his freedom. The storage unit transfer was scheduled for 2 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Marcus insisted on being there personally, wanted to see my face, when I had to watch him take possession of the last things I'd claimed to care about. He brought Davidson with him supposedly to ensure everything was handled legally, but really just to witness my final humiliation. I met them at the facility with Patricia playing my role to the end. When we opened the unit, Marcus's eyes lit up at the furniture visible in front. An authentic Victorian settee, a grandfather clock boxes labeled with things like China set silver service family photos. He made a show of examining items, holding up a vintage jewelry box and asking if there was anything valuable inside. I let my voice break as I told him it had been my grandmother's, worth nothing except memories. He tossed it back into a box carelessly, making sure I saw his indifference to my pain. The paperwork transfer was simple. I signed over ownership of the unit and its contents to Marcus completely and irrevocably. He made sure to read that last word out loud, slowly savoring each syllable. Davidson produced an inventory list for insurance purposes, but Marcus waved it off. He'd do his own inventory later, he said, when he could take his time going through everything, deciding what to keep and what to throw away. The threat was clear. My family treasures might end up in a dumpster just to spite me. As we left the storage facility, Marcus couldn't resist one final twist of the knife. He mentioned casually that he and Brittany were getting married. The wedding would be at our old country club, the same ballroom where we'd had our reception. He was sending me an invitation, he said, because he wanted me to see how a real celebration looked when you were with the right person. Davidson actually looked uncomfortable at the unnecessary cruelty, but Patricia kept her expression neutral, her hand on my arm the only sign of support. Back in my apartment that night, I opened a bottle of wine I'd been saving, a good bottle hidden from the asset division. I called Patricia and we talked for an hour, not about the case, but about her vacation plans, her daughter's college applications, normal things. She asked me carefully if I was okay with how everything had ended. I told her I was exactly where I needed to be. She laughed, understanding perfectly what I meant, and said she looked forward to seeing the next act. Marcus's wedding planning with Brittany became a social media spectacle. Every detail posted, hashtagged, shared. The ring he bought her was twice the size of mine naturally. Their engagement party was written up in the local society pages, with a photo of them toasting with champagne. The article mentioned Marcus's recent business successes, his expansion into new markets, his bright future. It also mentioned in a small aside his recent divorce from his starter wife. That's what I'd become in the narrative, the starter wife he'd outgrown. 3 months passed in this new normal. I kept my head down, focused on rebuilding. I'd started freelancing, taking on marketing clients who didn't know or care about my personal drama. The work was steady, not glamorous, but it paid the bills and kept me busy. I joined a gym in Bridgeport, made a few friends who didn't know. Marcus didn't know my story. To them, I was just Evelyn, the woman who did killer spin classes and always brought homemade cookies to the front desk staff. Marcus, meanwhile, was expanding his criminal enterprise, though he didn't know the walls were closing in. His insider trading had become bolder, more reckless. The SEC investigation James had uncovered was advancing investigators building their case slowly, methodically. The storage unit sat untouched in his possession, a ticking time bomb he visited once to take photos of the valuable furniture to show off to friends. He never bothered to look deeper into the boxes, never suspected that beneath the Christmas ornaments and photo albums lay the documentation of every crime he'd committed. The wedding invitations went out on expensive cardstock with gold embossing. Mine arrived on a Tuesday, delivered to my tiny apartment like a declaration of victory. The date was set for September, 6 months after our divorce. Inside, Brittany had written a personal note in purple ink. She hoped I could make it, she said, and that there were no hard feelings. After all, the heart wants what it wants. I kept the invitation on my refrigerator right next to a photo James had given me of federal agents surveilling Marcus's office building. The FBI raid came at 5:47 on a Tuesday morning in August, 3 weeks before Marcus's wedding. I knew it was happening because James still had contacts who gave him a heads up, though I had to act surprised when the news broke. 40 federal agents descended on Marcus's house, simultaneously armed with warrants for his arrest and the seizure of all assets potentially connected to his financial crimes. The local news had cameras there within minutes, broadcasting the whole thing live. I watched from my apartment, coffee in hand, as they led Marcus out in handcuffs. He was wearing silk pajamas and no shoes, his hair sticking up at odd angles. The mighty investment banker who destroyed me in court was now doing the perp walk in bare feet, trying to shield his face from the cameras. Brittany came running out after him, screaming, mascara streaming down her face. She was wearing one of his dress shirts, and nothing else, the picture of a scandal that would be plastered across every gossip blog by noon. The IRS moved simultaneously with the FBI, freezing every account Marcus had access to. His personal accounts, business accounts, investment portfolios, even the joint account he'd opened with Brittany for wedding expenses. In the span of 30 minutes, Marcus went from millionaire to unable to access a single penny. His credit cards were canceled, his brokerage accounts locked his assets under federal seal. The Porsche was loaded onto a flatbed truck as evidence, followed by the Mercedes, even Brittany's Range Rover he'd bought her as an engagement gift. But the real bomb dropped when the FBI executed their warrant for the storage unit. I got a call from Patricia around noon, her voice carefully professional but with an undercurrent of glee. The federal agents had discovered a treasure trove of evidence in a storage unit registered to Marcus, she said. Boxes and boxes of documents showing insider trading, tax evasion, wire fraud, embezzlement. There were emails, bank records, trading documentation, even recordings Marcus had made of conversations with clients discussing illegal trades. It was in the words of one federal prosecutor, like Christmas morning for white-collar crime investigators. The storage unit inventory was meticulous. The FBI cataloged every single item, including a detailed ledger I'd created that cross-referenced each document with the specific crime it evidenced. It was all there, 5 years of systematic criminal activity, documented better than if Marcus had been keeping records for prosecution himself. The best part was a box labeled Family Tax Returns that contained forged documents with my signature, but also Marcus's practice versions, where he'd perfected copying my handwriting. He'd literally created evidence of his own forgery. The SEC's investigation, which had been moving slowly, suddenly went into overdrive. With the evidence from the storage unit, they could trace every illegal trade, every insider tip, every manipulation Marcus had orchestrated. The total was staggering, over $3 million in illegal profits, affecting dozens of companies and hundreds of investors. They found connections to other traders, a whole network of corruption that Marcus had been coordinating. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a hub in a wheel of financial crime that reached into some of the biggest firms on Wall Street. Marcus's law firm immediately terminated him and issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. Clients he'd brought in withdrew their business. His name was removed from the building directory, his office cleaned out, and his belongings dumped in boxes in the lobby for pickup. Except there was no one to pick them up, because Marcus was sitting in federal detention, unable to make the $2 million bail the judge had set. His assets were frozen, and suddenly none of his wealthy friends were returning calls about helping with bail money. Brittany lasted exactly 3 days after the arrest before she packed up and disappeared. She cleaned out what little jewelry hadn't been seized, and the designer clothes Marcus had bought her, loaded them into an Uber, and vanished. Her social media accounts went dark, the wedding planning websites showing the event as canceled. The country club, which had stood by Marcus through the divorce, quietly revoked his membership and returned the deposit for the wedding reception. I received a subpoena to testify as a witness 2 weeks later. The federal prosecutor, a sharp woman named Diana Chen, made it clear from our first meeting that I was considered a victim in Marcus's crimes, not a co-conspirator. The forged signatures, the hidden assets, the way he'd structured everything to keep me in the dark while potentially making me liable, it all pointed to a pattern of abuse that went beyond just financial crimes. She asked me about the storage unit, and I told her the truth that I discovered these documents after our divorce, when I went to retrieve my grandmother's things. The story I crafted was perfect because it was partially true. I had gone to the storage unit after the divorce to get family heirlooms. I had been shocked to discover boxes of financial documents hidden among my things. I had immediately contacted authorities when I realized what they were. The fact that I'd been the one to put them there was unprovable. Marcus had signed the transfer papers taking full ownership. As far as any legal record showed, those boxes had been his responsibility from the moment he took possession. Marcus tried to claim I'd planted the evidence, of course. Through his public defender, because Davidson had dropped him the moment the FBI showed up, he argued that I'd orchestrated everything as revenge for the divorce. But the documents were dated over 5 years. The emails came from his accounts. The recordings were in his voice. His practice signatures proving he'd forged mine were particularly damning. The prosecutor actually laughed when the defense suggested I'd somehow manufactured 5 years of evidence and planted it without Marcus knowing. The investigation revealed even more than what I documented. Marcus hadn't just been trading on insider information, he'd been selling that information to others. He'd been taking bribes to manipulate certain trades affecting stock prices for personal gain. He'd been using his clients' portfolios for his own benefit, churning accounts to generate commissions, making trades that benefited him rather than them. The elderly couple whose retirement he managed had lost 30% of their savings to his manipulation. Local news covered the story extensively. The golden boy of Westport's finance scene brought low by his own greed. They interviewed neighbors who talked about his flashy lifestyle, his parade of young girlfriends even during our marriage, his arrogant attitude. Margaret from next door gave an interview where she mentioned how sweet and devoted I'd been, how Marcus had treated me terribly, how karma had finally caught up with him. The narrative was shifting from Marcus, the successful banker wronged by his crazy ex-wife, to Marcus the criminal who destroyed his faithful spouse. My phone rang constantly with reporters wanting my story. I gave one interview carefully coached by Patricia, where I appeared sad but dignified. I spoke about discovering the truth after our divorce, my shock at the extent of his crimes, my sympathy for his other victims. I wore a simple black dress, no jewelry, minimal makeup. The wronged woman who'd survived and was trying to move forward. The interview went viral, particularly the moment where I teared up talking about the elderly couple who'd lost their retirement savings. Marcus's mother, Eleanor, reached out to me through Patricia. She wanted to meet to apologize, to explain that she'd always known something was off about her son, but had hoped marriage would settle him. We met for coffee in a small cafe in Norwalk neutral territory. She looked older, defeated, wearing shame like a heavy coat. She told me she'd suspected the affairs, had even confronted Marcus once, but he'd convinced her I was imagining things. She'd chosen to believe her son over the evidence in front of her. She brought a box with her, my actual grandmother's china, that had been in the storage unit. The FBI had released personal items not related to the crimes, and she'd claimed them knowing they were really mine. As she handed it over, she said something that stayed with me. She said Marcus had been keeping score his whole life, but never realized the game was rigged against everyone who got close to him. She'd lost her son long before the FBI took him away. He'd been lost the moment he decided winning was worth more than love. The federal trial began in January, 5 months after Marcus's arrest. He was facing 15 different counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, and conspiracy. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They had the documents from the storage unit testimony from CO conspirators, who'd flipped for plea deals, recorded conversations, where Marcus explicitly discussed illegal trades, his own voice on tape laughing about how the SEC would never catch him, how he was too smart for the system. I was called to testify on a cold Thursday morning. The courthouse was packed with media, former colleagues of Marcus's, and curious members of the public who'd followed the scandal. Marcus sat at the defense table in an ill-fitting suit, his expensive wardrobe having been seized as potentially purchased with criminal proceeds. He'd lost weight in federal detention, his golden tan faded to a sickly pallor. When I walked past him to the witness stand, he tried to catch my eye, but I looked straight ahead. Diana Chen led me through my testimony with surgical precision. She had me describe our marriage, Marcus's control over our finances, his secretive behavior. I testified about finding documents after the divorce, my shock at discovering the extent of his criminal activity. When she asked about the forged signatures, I broke down crying, describing how violated I felt, knowing he'd implicated me in his crimes without my knowledge. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, looked at Marcus with undisguised disgust. The cross-examination by Marcus's public defender was brutal but ineffective. He tried to paint me as a vengeful ex-wife, but I had answers for everything. Why didn't I know about the crimes during marriage? Marcus handled all our finances and told me it was too complex for me to understand. Why did I take the storage unit in the divorce, then give it to him? I'd initially wanted to keep my family heirlooms, but Marcus had fought so hard for it I'd given up, like I'd given up everything else. Every question designed to trap me only made Marcus look worse. Other witnesses painted an even darker picture. Brittany testified for the prosecution in exchange for immunity, describing how Marcus had used her to gather information from other executives at the firm. She thought it was just pillow talk, she claimed, not knowing she was part of an insider trading scheme. His former colleagues testified about suspicious trades, unusual patterns, conversations, where Marcus had hinted at having special information. The elderly couple whose retirement he'd destroyed gave heartbreaking testimony about trusting him with their life savings. The forensic accountant, who analyzed the evidence from the storage unit, spent 2 days on the stand walking the jury through the intricate web of Marcus's crimes. She showed how he'd layered transaction after transaction, moving money through multiple accounts to hide its origins. She demonstrated how he'd used family members' social security numbers to open accounts they didn't know about, including mine. The total theft and fraud amounted to over $4 million, not including the tax evasion, which added another $2 million in liability. Marcus's defense was pathetic. He claimed he'd been set up, that competitors were jealous of his success. He tried to argue that the trades were legitimate based on public information anyone could have accessed. When that didn't work, he pivoted to claiming diminished capacity, that the stress of his divorce had made him temporarily unable to distinguish right from wrong. The prosecutor actually laughed out loud at that one, pointing out that most of the crimes had been committed years before we'd separated. When Marcus took the stand in his own defense, it was a disaster. His arrogance, barely contained during the trial, came out in full force. He lectured the jury about finance, talked down to the prosecutor, and showed zero remorse for his victims. When asked about the elderly couple's lost retirement, he actually said they should have diversified their portfolio better. The jury forewoman's face went from skeptical to openly hostile in the span of that single answer. The verdict came back in less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. I was sitting in the gallery when they read it, maintaining my composure, while inside I felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost physical. Marcus's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, anger, panic, and finally a hollow emptiness as he realized his life as he knew it was over. The judge ordered him remanded to custody immediately, denying bail pending sentencing. As the bailiffs cuffed him, he turned to look at me one last time. I met his gaze steadily, letting him see that I wasn't broken, wasn't destroyed. I was still standing while he was being led away in chains. The sentencing hearing was held 6 weeks later. The judge, after hearing victim impact statements, including one from me about the emotional and financial abuse I'd suffered, sentenced Marcus to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay full restitution to his victims, though with his assets seized, that was largely symbolic. The judge called his crimes a betrayal of trust that struck at the heart of the financial system, noting that white-collar criminals like Marcus often did more damage than street criminals because they destroyed lives while wearing expensive suits. After the sentencing, there was the matter of our divorce decree. Patricia filed a motion to revisit the settlement based on Marcus's fraud. Since he'd hidden assets and committed crimes that affected our marital property, the original divorce agreement was invalidated. The judge agreed immediately. Everything Marcus had gotten in the divorce was now subject to seizure as proceeds of crime, but I was entitled to recover my legitimate share of our legitimate assets. It took months to sort through what was criminal proceeds versus legitimate marital property. But in the end, I recovered about $600,000, my actual fair share of what we'd built together before Marcus had turned to crime. The house was sold at federal auction, but I didn't want it anyway. Too many memories, too much pain, the country club membership, the cars, the expensive toys Marcus had accumulated, all gone to pay restitution to his victims. The storage unit, that infamous storage unit that had been Marcus's downfall, became evidence in 3 other federal cases against Marcus's co-conspirators. The FBI called it one of the most comprehensive private collections of financial crime evidence they'd ever seen. Someone they said had done an exceptional job documenting and organizing everything. I accepted the compliment on behalf of whoever that anonymous hero might have been. One unexpected moment came when Eleanor Marcus's mother approached me outside the courthouse after the asset hearing. She handed me an envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. She said it was from Marcus's college fund, that she'd never given him money her late husband had set aside that Marcus didn't know about. She wanted me to have it, she said, as an apology for what her son had put me through. I tried to refuse, but she insisted. She said I'd earned it by surviving Marcus and having the strength to move forward. The local newspaper ran a follow-up story 6 months after the trial, with the headline, "From Riches to Rags, the Fall of Marcus Thompson." There was a photo of him in his federal prison uniform inmate number, visible a far cry from the Armani suits and Rolex watches. The article mentioned me briefly as the ex-wife who'd discovered his crimes and helped bring him to justice. They called me a hero. I didn't correct them, but I didn't embrace the title either. I was just a woman who'd refused to be a victim. 1 year later, I stood in my new townhouse in Stamford, watching the sunset through floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the harbor. It wasn't as grand as the Westport mansion, but it was mine, purchased with my own money in my own name. The walls were decorated with my own choices' colors. Marcus would have hated art, he would have mocked. My grandmother's china was displayed in a cabinet I'd bought at an antique store. Each piece a reminder that sometimes the things that matter most have nothing to do with money. My marketing consultancy had taken off in ways I'd never expected. The notoriety from the trial had actually helped positioning me as someone who'd overcome adversity and rebuilt from nothing. Clients appreciated my story, saw me as someone who understood struggle and perseverance. I specialized in helping small businesses run by women, particularly those going through divorces or starting over after life changes. My rates were fair, my work was excellent, and my calendar was booked solid for the next 6 months. I'd also started a support group for financial abuse survivors. We met weekly in a community center sharing stories, resources, and strategies. Some were going through divorces, others had escaped abusive relationships, all had been controlled through money. I taught them about hidden assets, protecting their credit, recognizing the warning signs I'd missed. One woman, Sandra, told me I'd saved her life by helping her document her husband's tax fraud before he could implicate her. Another Marie used my advice to recover $200,000 her ex had hidden in cryptocurrency. James Morrison, the private investigator who'd helped me uncover Marcus's crimes, became more than just a professional contact. We'd started having coffee after my support group meetings, talking about everything except Marcus and the case. He was funny, kind, respectful of boundaries. He'd been through his own difficult divorce years ago, understood the importance of taking things slow. We'd been dating for 4 months, nothing serious yet, just enjoying each other's company without pressure or expectations. He made me laugh, something I'd forgotten how to do during my marriage. The letter from Marcus arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded through his lawyer. I recognized his handwriting immediately, the same precise script he'd used to forge my signature on fraudulent documents. I considered throwing it away unopened, but curiosity won. It was 3 pages of blame, anger, and self-pity. He accused me of orchestrating his downfall, claimed I'd destroyed his life out of jealousy. He said I'd never find another man like him. He was right about that last part, thank God. I read it once, then fed it into my shredder, watching his words become confetti. I kept in touch with Eleanor, Marcus's mother. We had lunch once a month, an odd friendship born from shared survival. She told me about visiting him in prison, how he still blamed everyone but himself. He was working in the prison library, she said, teaching financial literacy to other inmates. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She'd sold the family house, moved to a modest apartment, and started volunteering at a women's shelter. She said helping women escape men like her son was her penance for enabling him for so long. My family had rallied around me once they understood the full story. Lauren, my sister, had become my fiercest advocate, telling everyone who'd listen about how I'd outsmarted a criminal mastermind. My parents, initially devastated by the divorce, now bragged about their daughter, the survivor. Thanksgiving that year was at my townhouse. The whole family crowded around my dining table, eating off my grandmother's china, toasting with wine that cost $15 a bottle and tasted like freedom. I also heard through the grapevine about Marcus's fellow inmates. Apparently, white-collar criminals weren't popular in federal prison, especially ones who'd stolen from elderly retirees. He'd been assigned to protective custody after several incidents. His days of being the alpha male in any room were over. He spent his time alone writing appeals that were consistently denied, maintaining his innocence to anyone who'd listen. The golden boy of Westport had become just another number in the federal system. The universe has an interesting sense of humor. The country club that had banned me after the divorce reached out, offering to reinstate my membership with a formal apology for their treatment. I declined politely. I'd found a different golf club, one where the members were doctors and teachers and small business owners, people who worked for their money honestly. My handicap had improved significantly without the pressure of playing with Marcus's judgmental friends. I even won the Women's Club Championship, a small trophy that meant more to me than any of the expensive jewelry Marcus had bought with stolen money. One evening I was having dinner with friends when someone mentioned seeing Brittany. She was working as a receptionist at a dental office, living with her parents, trying to rebuild her reputation. She'd apparently tried to leverage her brief notoriety into an influencer career. But being known as the mistress of a convicted felon wasn't the brand opportunity she'd hoped for. I felt a surprising lack of anger toward her. She'd been 23, dazzled by Marcus's wealth and charm. She'd been as much a victim of his manipulation as anyone, just in a different way. Patricia and I remained close friends beyond our professional relationship. She'd never sent me a final bill for her services, claiming that watching Marcus get what he deserved was payment enough. We'd go to lunch occasionally, and she'd update me on other cases where she was using similar strategies, helping women document financial abuse while appearing to surrender. She called it the Evelyn method, and said she'd used it to help a dozen women escape with evidence that later proved crucial in criminal cases against their ex-husbands. My work with the support group led to speaking engagements at women's conferences, domestic violence shelters, and financial planning seminars. I tell my story, emphasizing the importance of financial independence, maintaining separate accounts, and trusting your instincts when something feels wrong. Women would approach me afterward, tears in their eyes, saying they saw themselves in my story. Some were just starting to suspect their husbands of financial impropriety, others were deep in divorce proceedings. I gave them all the same advice. Document everything. Trust no one completely with your financial future, and never underestimate the power of patience. The best moment came when I received a letter from the elderly couple whose retirement Marcus had decimated. They'd recovered most of their money through the restitution process and wanted to thank me for my role in exposing his crimes. They invited me to their 50th wedding anniversary party, calling me their guardian angel. At the party, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, they toasted to second chances and the courage to stand up to bullies. I cried happy tears for the first time in years. Looking back, I realized the storage unit gambit had been more than just revenge. It had been reclamation. For years, Marcus had controlled the narrative, our finances, my sense of self-worth. He'd made me doubt my intelligence, my instincts, my value beyond being his wife. But in those months of secret planning, documenting his crimes, setting the trap he'd walk into with his own greed, I'd rediscovered my strength. I'd proven to myself that I wasn't the weak, dependent woman he'd tried to create. I was smart, capable, and patient enough to play a long game he never saw coming. The townhouse became a symbol of my new life. I painted the bedroom a deep burgundy, a color Marcus had called trashy. I adopted 2 cats from a shelter, something he'd never allowed because he claimed to be allergic, though I later learned he just didn't like animals. I cooked elaborate Indian and Thai dishes, cuisines he'd refused to eat. Every choice I made was a small act of rebellion against the prison he'd built around me during our marriage. Freedom tasted like pad thai at midnight and felt like cats purring on my lap while I worked. My consultancy evolved into a full agency. I hired 2 employees, young women fresh from college who reminded me of myself before Marcus had tried to dim my light. I mentored them, taught them about business, but also about recognizing toxic relationships, maintaining independence, and never letting anyone make them feel small. We landed major clients, including a national nonprofit focused on financial literacy for women. My name in the business world was no longer tied to being Marcus's ex-wife, but to being a successful entrepreneur who'd built something from nothing. One afternoon while organizing files, I found our wedding album buried in a box I'd forgotten to unpack. I flipped through it, looking at the young woman in white, who'd believed in fairy tales, and the man in the tuxedo, who'd already been planning his crimes. I didn't feel sad or angry anymore, just a distant sort of pity for both of them. She didn't know what was coming, and he didn't know that his greed would be his undoing. I kept one photo, the one of me with my grandmother's china visible in the background at the reception, then donated the album to an art project about survivor stories. James and I grew closer, our relationship developing at a pace that felt healthy and sustainable. He understood my need for independence, my reluctance to merge finances or move too quickly. He had his own townhouse, his own life, his own friends. We complemented each other without consuming each other. When he proposed after a year of dating, it was with the understanding that we'd maintain separate accounts, sign a prenup that protected both of us, and never let money become a weapon in our relationship. The ring was modest, purchased with cash he'd saved, and it was perfect. Life had a rhythm now that felt authentic. Monday support groups, Tuesday date nights with James, Wednesday yoga classes, where I'd finally learned to quiet my mind. Thursdays were for client meetings, Fridays for working from home with the cats. Weekends varied between speaking engagements, time with family, or just reading in my Harborview living room. It was a life Marcus would have called boring middle class beneath ambition. It was also peaceful, honest, and entirely mine. The news came on a Thursday afternoon. Marcus had lost his final appeal. His sentence would stand 12 years with no possibility of early release beyond good behavior credits. He'd serve at least 10 years emerging from prison in his mid-40s with no money, no career, and no prospect of returning to finance. His broker's license was permanently revoked, his ability to work in any fiduciary capacity gone forever. He'd exit prison a convicted felon who'd have to rebuild from absolute zero, something he'd tried to condemn me to, but had ultimately brought upon himself. That night, I raised a glass of wine to the woman I'd been, the one who'd sat in that storage unit, carefully placing evidence in boxes marked with innocent labels. She'd been scared, but determined, heartbroken, but not broken. She'd known that justice required patience, that revenge was best served not cold, but calculated. She'd saved not just herself, but dozens of Marcus's victims, people who'd recovered money they'd thought was gone forever. That woman had been a hero, even if she'd never wear the cape publicly. The deepest lesson from all of this wasn't about revenge or justice. It was about the power of knowing your own worth independent of anyone else's validation. Marcus had taken everything in the divorce because he genuinely believed that without the material possessions, without the money and status, I would be nothing. He'd never understood that those things had never defined me. The house, the cars, the country club membership, even the marriage itself, they were just external trappings. The real me, the one who could strategize and survive and ultimately thrive, had been there all along, waiting for the chance to emerge. The storage unit had been perfect karma. Marcus had wanted it specifically because he thought it contained things I valued, memories and heirlooms I'd begged to keep. His cruelty in taking it, his glee in causing me pain, had been his undoing. He'd been so focused on winning, on taking everything, that he'd never questioned why I'd suddenly stopped fighting. His hubris, his absolute certainty in his own superiority, had blinded him to the trap that was closing around him. He'd taken everything in the divorce, including the evidence of his own crimes, and delivered it directly to the FBI with his name on the title. Now, as I stood in my home office looking at the business I'd built, the life I'd created, the freedom I'd earned, I realized something profound. Marcus had actually done me a favor. If he'd been a mediocre husband instead of a terrible one, if he'd hidden his affairs better, if he'd shared even a fraction of the marital assets fairly, I might have stayed trapped in that gilded cage forever. His cruelty had forced me to find my strength. His greed had led to his imprisonment. His attempt to destroy me had ultimately freed me to become who I was always meant to be. The last laugh wasn't bitter or vengeful. It was the laugh of a woman who'd learned that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you're really made of. It was the laugh of someone who'd played a long game and won not just the battle, but the war. It was the laugh of freedom, of justice, of a life rebuilt on terms that were entirely my own. Marcus had taken everything in the divorce, but in the end, what he'd really taken was the road to his own destruction, paved with evidence he'd been too arrogant to examine. My grandmother used to say that the universe had a way of balancing the scales, but sometimes you had to put your thumb on them to help things along. As I closed my laptop and headed to meet James for dinner, wearing a dress Marcus would have hated, driving a car I'd bought myself, living a life he'd never understood the value of, I whispered a thank you to her memory. Her china sat in my cabinet, having survived the storage unit, the divorce, and the federal investigation. Like me, it had emerged intact, a little weathered perhaps, but still beautiful, still valuable, still worthy of display. The fortune cookie at dinner that night made me smile. It read, "Success is the best revenge." I tucked it into my wallet, a small reminder that sometimes the universe does indeed have a sense of humor. Marcus was eating prison food, wearing federal-issued clothing, counting days in a cell. I was eating sushi with a man who respected me, building a business that helped other women, living a life of integrity and purpose. The scales hadn't just balanced, they'd tipped entirely in my favor. As we drove home, James asked if I ever thought about what would have happened if Marcus hadn't been so greedy, if he'd just let me keep the storage unit. I thought about it for a moment, then smiled. If he'd shown even an ounce of humanity, the evidence might have stayed hidden forever. But Marcus couldn't help himself. His need to hurt me, to take everything, to win at all costs, had been hardwired into his DNA. In trying to destroy me, he'd destroyed himself. It was poetic justice of the highest order, written by his own hand, sealed by his own signature on the storage unit transfer papers. That's the thing about true justice. Sometimes it requires patience, strategy, and the wisdom to know when losing is actually winning. Marcus had taken everything in the divorce, but what he'd really taken was a one-way ticket to federal prison, hand delivered by his own hubris. And that, as my grandmother would have said, was worth more than all the Mercedes and country club memberships in Connecticut. So if you're watching this and you're going through something similar, if someone is trying to destroy you, take everything from you, remember this. Document everything. Keep copies. Be patient. Sometimes the best revenge isn't fighting back immediately. Sometimes it's letting them think they've won, while you quietly set the stage for their downfall. And always, always remember that material possessions can be replaced, but your integrity, your strength, and your ability to rebuild those are things no one can take from you. What's your story of justice served? Have you ever had someone's greed become their downfall? I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, if it gave you hope or strength, or just a moment of satisfaction, please hit that like button and subscribe. Share this with anyone who needs to hear that there's light at the end of even the darkest tunnel. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, living well truly is the best revenge. May you all find your own justice, your own peace, and your own path to freedom.